Hi, and welcome to the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. I'm your host, Yaakov Katz. On today's podcast, I'm joined by my friend Dan Feferman. Dan is an author, speaker, researcher with a focus on Israel, the Jewish world, and the wider Middle East. He just recently stepped down as the executive director of Sharaka, a Middle East-based NGO that has worked over the years since the Abraham Accords to build people-to-people peace between Israelis and Arabs all throughout the Muslim world. He worked to promote the Abraham Accords to new audiences. And we talk a lot about on this podcast what can be done, for example, to foster greater ties in this post-October 7th reality, and what can be done to help bring about the big deal, the one that Donald Trump wants, and obviously Benjamin Netanyahu wants, normalization with Saudi Arabia. Dan was also in the past a fellow at JPPI. And there he researched anti-Semitism, the BDS movement, religious pluralism in Israel. And about a year ago, he wrote a book called In Search of Authenticity, where he looked at trends throughout the American Jewish community. What is happening that's new? Where is there new engagement? And what can be done to open up the boundaries, the borders, the anachronistic way of life or tradition for some people within Judaism to bring in some of these new communities? We talk about what he discovered in his research on this topic, as well as what it can be applied also in a post-October 7th reality. And as I mentioned to Dan towards the end of our conversation, I found that in both of these two hats that he has worn, the research he did for us at JPPI, the work he has done at Sharaka, he's a man who's looking to build those bridges, to open up topics, whether it's Judaism or Israel and the Arab world, to one and another. I strongly recommend you pay attention. Hey, Dan, it's great to have you on the JPPI podcast. How are you?
Good to see you. Good morning.
So you are a former JPPI fellow, and beyond that,
so. Yeah.
yes, beyond that, a friend and just a very smart guy who really has a lot to say about different interesting issues. I will just say, I was looking for your email about a week ago in my Gmail, and I came across an email I actually received from your father, maybe like 10 years ago, if not more, writing to me about something I had written in the Jerusalem Post and mentioning to me that he has a son who's an officer in the IDF and how he also likes geopolitical military topic issues. So it was quite funny. I totally forgot about that email exchange I had with your father many, many years ago. A good old Midwestern man from Indiana. So, as someone who grew up in Chicago, I definitely have that draw to it. So I appreciate it.
I was actually trying to think where we first met, and I realized I think it was when you were still a military correspondent for Jerusalem Post, and I was one of the assistants to Benny Gantz when he was the deputy chief, and I used to handle all his press conferences. And I think that's where we first met. So,
yeah, in his office on the 14th floor of the Kiryat. That's right. And I was actually funny you bring this up. I'll never forget. I was at his last briefing with military reporters when he basically was resigning. Right, he had lost out to become the next chief of staff after Gabi Ashkenazi. Yoav Gallant was supposed to become the chief of staff. He had basically hung up his uniform. He was going. Yep. He was leaving. He wasn't yet sure what he was going to do. He was talking about traveling, and then a few weeks later, suddenly the man is back.
He got the phone call. That's right.
Exactly. So that's a whole other story in of itself. But we're talking because there's a bunch of things that we have to talk about. You were up until recently the executive director. You're still the co-chair of the board of Sharaka, which is a very interesting organization that you'll tell us about, that has done a lot of work in wake of the last, I'd say, 4 and a bit years of the Abraham Accords to strengthen the resilience of those ties. But before we kind of get to that and look to the future of what this all means for the Middle East and the region and what's next for the Abraham Accords and Trump with Saudi, et cetera, I want to talk about a paper that you wrote about a year ago for JPPI shortly before stepping down, when it was called In Search of Authenticity, New Expressions of Jewish Life in North America. And you were looking at kind of Jewish identity, renewal initiatives that were underway, a lot of talk about young folks and ways to maybe create inroads into new communities and different new initiatives. Very interesting in looking at what are these new frameworks? How can millennials be engaged with? What are these emerging communities? Why is everyone talking about the decline of engagement of young people when maybe there actually is some sparks of hope? And this was obviously written before October 7th, so we're going to get to October 7th in a moment. But
Right.
first, kind of give us the overview of what you found in this study, because it's very interesting.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was on a speaking tour promoting my previous monograph for the Institute, which dealt with Israeli pluralism, and I came across that these kinds of communities existed, and the buzzword that was going around them was that they were young, they were very creative, they were non-denominational, they were very independent-minded. And I came back, and JPPI's board chair, Dennis Ross, asked for the Institute to look coincidentally at the same kind of framework that he had come across in his personal life. And so I began to look at these different expressions of Jewish life. So we're talking about pluralistic yeshivas and different kinds of places for Jewish study. We're talking about non-denominational synagogues that seem to be absolutely packed and thriving, especially with young, non-affiliated, non-identified people. And so the study that came out, it's really, you can see it's a book-length study, essentially wanted to ask three major questions and then leave a whole bunch of questions for Jewish leaders. And one is, first of all, what's going on here? So is this just, some of the people I interviewed said just better synagogues, and maybe they're just doing it right when others are not doing it right? Or is this just a blip on the radar screen of the Jewish world? It's a little fad, it'll pass. And the conclusion that I came to is that there is something very real happening, and has been happening for, now I can say, the better part of 2 decades. At the time when I started looking into this, it was 10, 15 years back. And something's happening, something's real. It's happening on the margins of the Jewish world. It's happening outside of the denominational frameworks, which is why maybe a lot of people didn't pay attention to it. And where it's happening, there's a lot of creativity, and it seems to be working. It seems to be working in getting those same kind of people who did not feel comfortable or drawn to the mainstream institutions, the major, reform or conservative synagogues that you and I grew up with, the federations, those kinds of things. And it was drawing them in a different way. And so then I set about, first of all, to map this out. It had never really been mapped out. There's been a few studies here and there done by researchers in this field, but in a coherent sense. And then secondly, to try to talk about what this means. Is this going to deeply change the American Jewish landscape? And for kind of the most practical element that I try to leave funders, Jewish leaders, et cetera, here with is there a playbook that can be decoded for mainstream institutions, for large synagogues, for federations, for Jewish institutions and funders to say, hey, if we look at this playbook, maybe we can do a much better job of engaging with this next generation. And interestingly enough, we found a lot of people, I won't say a majority, I won't say, but certainly a very, very sizable minority of people who consistently identified as non-denominational, who do engage, or at least want to engage in Jewish life in some way or another. And then at the very end, I kind of come to this conclusion that there are pockets, mostly in the major cities around the United States, these ecosystems of Jewish innovation and creativity. And, it kind of going back to the field of dreams, if you build it, they will come. And that was the big question, is where these...
One of my favorite movies. Really.
Yeah, absolutely. And Rabbi Kevin Costner, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the conclusions that I come to, and that we actually pitched a follow-up project at JPPI, it never happened, was if we can identify all of these things, if we can build these parts of the ecosystem, that it seems to be able to work to draw these people out of the woodwork and get them re-engaged in Jewish life.
So, I mean, very interesting, but maybe give us an example, if you can, of one of these initiatives that you've discovered. I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot to single out one,
No, sure.
but give us an example so we can kind of just maybe demonstrate to ourselves what is this like, and what are they doing?
Right,
that you talk about that roadmap or that framework of what Jewish funders and organizations should be looking at. But maybe through this example, we can get a better sense of what this means.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the main focus in the study, there's a network called the Jewish Emergent Network, and anybody who's spent time in some major Jewish cities around the United States probably came across these initiatives and maybe just didn't know that it was part of this framework. So, in New York, you have this synagogue that's on the one hand maybe neo-Hasidic, we could call it, but incredibly pluralistic. Rabbi David Ingber's Romemu Synagogue. If you go to the other side of the kind of the creativity and progressive spectrum, you have Amichai Lau's Lab Shul. It's literally called Lab Shul. And then in New York, you have Hadar, you have all these different kinds of innovative frameworks, and you have this big ecosystem. Of course, it's in New York. Boston has a lot of things going on. Of course, it's got Hebrew College, which is the main engine for, first of all, it's one of the biggest non-Orthodox rabbinic institutions in the world, but there's a lot of independent minyanim, which is something that I talk about a lot, and I actually map out for the first time this world of independent minyanim that's taking place. There's a major, old, established conservative synagogue in Boston that under its roof houses 3, 4, 5 more independent projects, and then they come together when it suits them, they split apart when they suits them, and that's another model. I found a major Reform synagogue that has a sort of Reform Chabad outreach style program under its roof that acts separately from the synagogue but is a part of the synagogue. And you have basically a Reform rabbis taking the Chabad playbook of outreach, of getting out in the community, of doing events in cafes and not necessarily in the stuffy walls of the synagogue, which can be really intimidating, we found, to a lot of young Jews, which is why they're scared. They don't have the Jewish literacy, they didn't grow up in that environment, and they're concerned to come into synagogue. In Chicago, where you're from, you have, of course, another one of these types of synagogues called Mishkan, the wandering, right? It's a wandering synagogue. But it also works within a larger. So
if I take it, kind of crystallize it to some extent, it's this ability to break down those boundaries, take you out of the stuffiness of the anachronistic of it, and make it renewal, right? Make it new, make it fresh, make it open,
and break down these bundled expectations of what it means to be a Jew in a certain kind of space. And so one of the interesting things that came out of almost all of these was, on the one sense, people were looking for much more serious, intense, as they all called it, authentic. Everyone kept using the word authentic, so that we actually changed the title because of it. Authentic Judaism, getting back to Jewish text. I don't know how you grew up. I grew up in a Reform community in the Midwest. I had never heard the word Gemara or Talmud until I was in college. And people are studying this now in pluralistic, outside the Orthodox world frameworks. And at the same time, people want to develop these critical, these nuanced and oftentimes more critical connections to Israel and to Zionism. Of course, this is all pre-October 7th.
Right.
And so, a lot of people said, well, if I'm part of the mainstream community, if I'm part of the large synagogue, I'm expected to think like this about Israel and like this about religiosity and like this about tradition. And what if I want to remix all of these expectations and practice it in a different way? And so it's answering a need for that. So that's where authentic came up a lot in one way. The other way was a lot of people said all these big synagogues and initiatives just feel reactionary, they feel scripted, they feel very, rote, and we want something that's much more, as one person I interviewed called it, heart-opening. Let's feel that kind of Hasidic connection to Jewish life and prayer.
Very interesting. But now let's jump and fast forward to October 7th. which obviously your paper came out just before that.
Right.
But now we are in October, the post-October 7th reality, and you don't necessarily have the data, but you do have the kind of the knowledge of what was happening and where people have been going since then. I mean, this movement, so kind of like you had, on the one hand, wow, this like new emerging movement, innovation within Jewish tradition and engagement with young people. And then comes October 7th, which very much unites the community, but also to some extent creates division and fractures the community. Like, how does this all play out?
Yeah, and if before I was doing this on the researcher analyst level and just really poring over every single community study ever done, through my work in Sharaka, I actually did hundreds of speaking tours and events in Jewish communities and Hillels and et cetera, all over the United States. So I got a very good on-the-ground feel for what was happening. There was a question that I throw around in the book that a lot of people I interviewed were talking about was, is there the attempt at the emergence of a diaspora American Judaism that is not Israel-centric, that is agnostic on Israel, and to its extremes, even anti-Zionist or just kind of post-Zionist. Nobody really said anti-Zionist, but it was definitely post-Zionist. It was agnostic. It was Zionism and Israel should not be don't feel like they're a part of our core Jewish identity. Jewish practice, Jewish life in the diaspora is. And that was kind of the trend that seemed to be happening, not in all of these communities. Some of them said absolutely we're Zionists, it's part of who we are. But in a lot of them and a lot of the people that I interviewed. My sense is October 7th was a huge kind of awakening and decision point for a lot of these kind of people. I'd be very curious to go back and talk to them. I coincidentally, one of these people who I interviewed is a family member, and so we know exactly what happened with them, and they went further towards the anti-Zionist side of things. But looking at how echo chambers developed online and how the Hamas propaganda machine worked so effectively, I don't blame these kind of people. What I did see in Hillel after Hillel, in Reform synagogue after Reform synagogue, and in the Hillels, we had a chance to engage with a lot of Jewish students who were definitely not part of the community, who were definitely on the progressive side. We did an entire, West Coast and also like liberal, elite colleges around the U.S. speaking tours, and we saw Jewish students were very much torn, very conflicted, and definitely coming back to this, because October 7th was not just an attack on Israel, it was such a visceral attack on their identities. They were also physically being attacked on campuses. And so I think October 7th brought that trend back to center in a way, brought a lot of these Jews back to Israel. It was such a fundamental attack on Jewish identity that there was no Israeli policy to criticize here, right, on October 7th. It was just such a raw attack on our very core identity, our existence, followed by attacks on actual Jewish life in the United States and around the world, that I think it sharpened the answer to this question in a lot of ways.
On the other hand, we do have the post-October 7th, and I'll shift gears for a moment and talk to your other hat that you've been wearing for the last few years at Sharaka, and what that has done to the engagement or the dialogue that you've been trying to foster, right? So, you would have thought to some extent, and, definitely tell us a bit about Sharaka also as you answer this question, but some people would have thought that, comes October 7th, and this is, going to be the end of the Abraham Accords, right? Israel is bombing Gaza. Israel is killing a lot of people in Gaza. Israel is causing destruction in Gaza, whether justified or not. This is just the reality. The contrary is very much the truth to some extent, right? I mean, publicly maybe a bit of a cooling down, but people to people, still very strong flights. I always say to people, American Airlines, United Airlines, Delta, not flying to Israel, our great friends in America, but you got like 6 or 7 flights going between the UAE and Israel every single day. I mean, both ways. So it's about 12 flights actually, or something like that. It's like, it's ridiculous. So, the reality was that there still was this engagement. There still was this hunger for relations. I just read a piece the other day of a Emirati company and buying a third of some Israeli defense contractor that makes cameras or something for drones or whatever. I mean, like, there's still investment. There's economic progress. I mean, so talk to us about Sharaka. Talk to us about how October 7th also kind of changed your work
Sure.
in doing all of that.
Yeah, so Sharaka, it's an Arabic word. The branding, it's Arabic. It means partnership. And the whole idea was the Abraham Accords were just signed. How can we, at the time, it was a group of Israelis. I actually wasn't involved in the founding. It was a group of Israelis, Emiratis, Bahrainis who came together and said, how do we make this real? How do we deepen this? How do we build on the people-to-people connections and aspect? And it started, let's celebrate each other's holidays very publicly. Let's bring delegations of influencers and show all the positive sides of this and the positive side of each other's humanities. By the time I came aboard and I kind of started taking things also in a more educational direction, that's my style and my nature, I had begun to realize there is still a lot of pushback in the Arab world. The really important thing that these accords did, first of all, if you know anything about the Gulf countries, they have deep, deep respect for their leadership. And so when their leadership decides on the path, the people really go with them.
Right.
You're certainly not going to hear public criticism. Certainly in the UAE, for example, you're not going to hear public criticism about that decision, and people will follow the leader. They really, truly believe in that leadership. But most of the peoples of the Middle East didn't buy it. Went along maybe only formally, and in those countries where you have more freedom of speech, people very actively against it, and of course you still have the radical access pushing against it. What we realized was how precarious, on the public level, the public perception level, this whole thing was. We realized even as hosting the most educated people with many degrees, PhDs, worldly traveled people, how not only shockingly little did they know about Israel and about the Jews, but they had mountains and mountains of misinformation that we had to try to unravel. And so it's going to be a long process. And the way the Arab world works is things move slowly. We in Israel want to jump in and move as fast as possible and change things overnight. And the Arab world really doesn't work that way. Perceptions change slowly. Leaders take their time with their peoples. We set about to try to move that needle by engaging with shapers, movers, thinkers, religious leaders eventually, journalists, and making sure everything we're doing in a different way than most of the kind of peace efforts taking place before was public. Because how is the public going to shift its opinion if all they see is the negative stuff in the news and Al Jazeera, and then they don't see anything positive ever or humanizing or nuanced about Israel or about Israelis or Jews? That was the premise. That's what guided us.
So what was the way to go about that?
So we certainly continued with influencer type delegations like birthright trips. We always joke it's birthright for Arabs, and get them to Israel. Morocco looked very different. It's a really boisterous, big society. And then we started engaging with kind of shapers and movers and leaders from all over the world, diaspora, Arabs and Muslims. We ended up working and still are in places like Pakistan that don't have relations with Israel. And now, and it started getting to a point, and it's still at a point where people from Arab countries and Muslim countries that don't have relations are actually kind of seeking them out through the organization's framework, because at the top levels of the organization, it's really a joint civic venture between Israelis and people from the Gulf and people from Morocco and Muslim leaders living in the West as well. And we're still doing that. We're doing a lot of speaking tours promoting the concept of the Abraham Accords around the world. And we're also launching new projects. There's leadership academies that are starting to come out, Holocaust education program that's now been running for 2 years. So there's a lot of kind of different programs that are running under this. All of that had to change when we hit October 7th.
Okay, so we just kind of like the background and what's been done, but obviously October 7th has changed things. But how surprised were you by the fact that these ties have kind of maintained themselves and held, and also how that Saudi normalization is still very much alive and on the table?
Yeah, so it's funny. On October 8th, we were supposed to be hosting a very large delegation of young Arabs from all over the region as part of the Holocaust education program. They were shocked. I don't answer the phone on Shabbat, and they were shocked. Why is Dan answering the phone? This must be serious. I've built up, hundreds and hundreds of friendships and acquaintances from all over the Arab and Muslim world the last few years. And on October 7th, 8th, probably the first few weeks into it, we were getting a lot of phone calls, messages of concern and care, condemnation of what Hamas did, as much as it filtered to their media. And then once Israel started the counterattack in Gaza, once the Hamas propaganda machine turned on, it turned on before we ever did anything. Actually, there was a genocide from before our first fighter jet launched in the air. We were already committing genocide in Gaza. And then you saw who was falling for it and who wasn't. And there was a split. A lot of people who I had thought were fair-minded, media literate people were falling for the propaganda. And for the most part, the human connections didn't sever. We spent time building bonds with each other and learning. Some people did. Some people backed off and said, "You're monsters. You're worse than the Nazis," and they cut the connections. Some people said Israel is justified in defending itself, but why is it committing genocide against the Palestinians? It needs to differentiate between Hamas and the citizens. And then there was tensions, but the bonds didn't necessarily break. But there was a lot of people, mostly privately, some publicly, who were willing to completely side by Israel in this and say what's right is right and what's wrong is wrong, and we recognize this and we condemn Hamas, and we painfully support Israel's military response. And you saw this shift in the Arab world that you've never seen before in any kind of conflict between Israel and the Arab world. Most of the connections we made, most of the people that backed off from this activity did so not because they don't believe in it, just because they didn't want to deal with the public pressure, with the online social media pressure. The majority of people remained engaged to some extent or another. And within a month, we had groups, a different nature, different style, more journalists and kind of the braver side of things, but coming back to Israel and wanting to engage. And it's been a tremendous shift in the region that you're seeing. And part of it, in some part, is what we were trying to push. The Saudis are an interesting case here because what the Saudis are doing is purely strategic. Today, there are no people-to-people connections between Israel and Saudi. You have business people going back and forth, but it's strategic. And they realized, they're behind the Abraham Accords. So the Emiratis, but the Bahrainis for sure, don't sign the Abraham Accords back in 2020 without a big, kosher stamp, a hechsher from the Saudis, who are pushing a deep regional change. And what the Saudis, what the Gulf Arabs, what the Moroccans, what they all recognize is that besides the connection that the practical, tangible connection that they need with Israel on defense affairs, regarding the Iranian camp, on technology and food security and water technologies, etc., the Palestinian issue has been, first of all, hijacked by the Iran axis to galvanize and radicalize and give it a role in the Arab world. And secondly, it's preventing them from fully modernizing and becoming more modern. And they realize that if they don't become more liberal in the Arab sense, not in the Western sense, more open to foreigners, more open to the outside world, they cannot complete that transformation of modernization.
And Israel is a step along the way for that to happen?
Israel is a step and a symbol. Mm-hmm. It's a symbol of you crossed that very important step. You were able to take the monkey off the back of the Arab world that is the Palestinian conflict.
It was explained to me a couple of times that, one of the big differences, for example, between the UAE, the Emiratis, let's say, and the Saudis, is that the Emiratis, out of the 10 million people or so who live in the Emirates, only 1 million are really Emiratis, right? The rest are expats and people who work here, a lot of Indians, Pakistanis, whatever, from all over the world. So therefore, their public opinion, or the street opinion, like you said, people tend to follow leaders and respect leaders. In the Emirates, when the leaders decide something, we're now normalizing relations with Israel, they all fall in line. Saudi Arabia, a much bigger country, much bigger people. does have to really consider, like MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, and one day to be the leader, does have to take that into consideration more, which is why, for example, the Saudis have long insisted that there be an Israeli commitment to some sort of process with the Palestinians. Now, is that a two-state solution? Is that, yes, we promise to engage in a diplomatic political discussion, whatever that looks like. So far, Israel hasn't been able to do that. That's a separate conversation. Why?
Yeah.
But does that fit into your understanding of the difference between the two?
It's part of it, and let me unpack a few more, I think, important elements here. So one, yes, in the UAE, roughly 10, 11% of the population are the locals, but they have a lot more loyalty and legitimacy among the people than do any of the other Arab countries. It's really tremendous. I've spent a lot of time in the UAE, and I have to say their leadership is just incredibly effective. They give them an absolutely stellar quality of life that you don't see in any other Arab country. That's part of it. The UAE, of course, it's smaller overall. I've always kind of, the last few years I've been dubbing it as the R&D lab of the Arab world, the R&D lab of the Middle East. They're really 50 years ahead in their everything, in their on the public, policy level, on the strategic level. But they can also make decisions and take risks and chances that the Saudis can't. Mm-hmm. I will also, remind the listeners here. There was a stipulation when the UAE signed onto the Abraham Accords that Israel, at least publicly, was mulling annexation of parts of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. And part of the agreement, and the famous letter from Otaiba, the ambassador to Washington, was you need to shelve this idea. You need to, so they, at least publicly, sold it to their people and the region that they're saving the chances of a two-state solution in a Palestinian state by entering into this accord. Whether they believe it or not, that's a different question. But the bigger one is not just that. So what you said is correct, but the second part is so they don't just have a larger population. First of all, MBS's role, his leadership role, is not cemented in Saudi Arabia. There's a lot more jockeying for power that happens for the leadership position in Saudi Arabia than does certainly in the UAE and in many of the other countries. And so, if you recall, when MBS came to power as the crown prince a number of years ago, he famously put a lot of his competitors or potential critics in the Ritz-Carlton.
Really, when they talk about a golden cage jail.
Literally a golden cage jail. Yeah. He cracked down on some of the more hardline potential threats to his power, to the reforms he did. He did tremendous, by the way, nobody talks about this in Israel. He instituted tremendously wide-reaching religious reforms to the whole concept of religion and state in Saudi Arabia that are impacting the Arab world and the Muslim world in a way that people outside have no idea to what's happening, and it will have major positive impacts for decades to come. But this is not, a widely, completely popular thing. It's popular with the youth, but it's not popular with the entire society. So he's still kind of looking over his shoulder. It's not 100% certain that he's going to be the king, so he still has to take that into account. Mm-hmm. And lastly, let's not forget, the UAE is the UAE. Saudi Arabia is the custodian of the two holiest sites in Islam. And so Saudi Arabia is also seen as the de facto leader of certainly the Arab and probably the entire Muslim world. And
which opens up Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Indonesia, and all these other countries. Yeah.
100%. So when they take decisions on something like Israel or the Palestinian issue, they're not just doing it for Saudi Arabia like the Emiratis, like the Bahrainis. They're doing it in a certain way for the entire Arab and Muslim world. And so they have to be able to sell something, not just to their people, but to the region, that they did something for the Palestinian cause that was real and tangible.
So, Dan, I'm going to let you go, but before I do, I'm just going to say, I've no experience at all in psychology or anything like that, but I'm finding this thread, between what you did at JPPI when you were writing about In Search of Authenticity, the new expressions of Jewish life in North America, and the work you've done with Sharaka of trying to bridge those, ties there. Interesting. I like it. The Jewish ties, the Israeli Arab ties. There's a lot of searching going on here.
I like looking for the next trends. That's something I always enjoy doing.
Dan, it was great to have you on the podcast. Thanks so much for being with us.
Such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us on today's episode. As always, you can find us where podcasts can be found: Spotify, Apple, YouTube, and of course the homepage of Times of Israel. We will be back, on Monday for another episode of the Jewish People's Podcast. In the meantime, have a great weekend and a Shabbat Shalom.